Contact Report 587, 587th contact. Monday, 19th May 2014, 13:50 airs.
You surprise me, Ptaah, dear friend, for I did not expect you today. But be welcome, and also my greetings to you.
Greetings, Edward, dear friend. My coming at this time is really unusual, but since I had to make an effort for a certain thing that led me to Earth and which I finished, I do not want to miss to visit you.
So you have already done the thing, so I guess we will have some time to talk, especially about the answers to the questions that I wrote and that Florina called up to present to you.
I am in no hurry.
Good. Then I would like to start by presenting you with this excerpt from the 583rd contact conversation.
583rd contact conversation from 19th of March 2014.
But I think this will take a long time, because when I think about what Emmanuel said, that in the present time and also in the future, the peoples will rise up against their authorities, as it has just happened and is still happening in Ukraine and Crimea, then a lot of evil is still to be expected. For my part, however, I think that the whole unpleasant thing about Ukraine is the fault of the EU dictatorship, which is also flirting with the idea of incorporating this state into its dictatorial union.
I also see it that way.
Contact Report 587.
I said that it was the EU dictatorship's fault that the bloody riots and subversive machinations broke out in Ukraine.
That is correct. And for my part, I must also say that your statement is correct, because the EU wants to spread violently to the east, but it is also trying to bring Switzerland into its dictatorship, hoping for the unreasonableness of the homeland betraying elements who are making great efforts to sell their freedom and homeland to the EU dictatorship against lies and power.
We are not the only ones who know this. Look here, these articles. If you want to read them, please do. Former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt speaks plainly in them, which I can fully endorse, because he speaks out exactly what we have both also discussed privately.
Helmut Schmidt accuses EU of megalomania.
The former Chancellor accuses the EU Commission of exceeding its competencies in the Ukrainian conflict. The world political situation is similar to that shortly before the First World War. Former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt has sharply criticized the West's policy on Ukraine. In an interview with the Bild-Zeitung, he accused the EU commissioners of interfering too much in world politics, even though most commissioners know nothing about it. The most recent example is the EU Commission's attempt to annex Ukraine, he said. It was also wrong to try to attract Georgia. This is megalomania. We have no business there. Schmidt demanded more restraint in foreign policy from the Commission. Officials and bureaucrats presented Ukraine with the apparent choice of choosing between East and West. In recent days, several active and former SPD politicians had criticized that the EU had contributed to the tensions in the Ukrainian crisis. In the morning, the SPD foreign policy expert Niels Ennen also voiced this criticism on Deutschlandfunk radio. The EU had de facto conducted accession negotiations. It had become clear that this could not go well in the long run. Chancellor Angela Merkel's CDU had firmly rejected the criticism of the EU. It was the former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych himself who put Ukraine on a westerly course, she said. A third world war? Former Chancellor Schmidt also criticized the German government. The Geneva Conference in mid-April, planned by Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, SPD, was certainly urgently needed. Unfortunately, however, there is currently no one to put forward constructive proposals on the future of Ukraine, Schmidt complained. The conflict over Ukraine reminded him of the situation in 1914 before the First World War, Schmidt said. The two were increasingly comparable. He did not want to provoke a third world war. But the danger of the situation worsening, as in August 1914, is growing day by day. In Ukraine, pro-Russian separatists had recently held internationally unrecognized referendums in 2 regions, in which a majority voted for independence from the government in Kiev. Earlier, the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea had broken away in a controversial referendum and joined Russia.
Zeit Online Germany, 16th May 2014, 2:05-17.
Helmut Schmidt accuses EU of megalomania.
Former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, SPD, has sharply criticized the EU Commission. Brussels interferes too much in world politics, although most commissioners hardly know anything about it. Hamburg. The most recent example is the EU Commission's attempt to annex Ukraine, Schmidt told the Bild newspaper. You are presenting Ukraine with the apparent choice of having to choose between West and East. Schmidt also condemned the attempt to bind Georgia more closely to the EU. Remember, Georgia is outside Europe. This is megalomania. We have no business there. The former chancellor compared the Ukrainian crisis with the tensions shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. The danger that the situation will worsen like it did in August 1914 is growing day by day. Asked whether he saw Europe on the brink of the abyss as it was then, he said, "The situation seems increasingly comparable to me." Europe, the Americans, also the Russians, are behaving as the author Christopher Clark described it in his worthwhile book about the beginning of the First World War, like sleepwalkers.
Helmut Schmidt gives tips to the EU. Foto: Maurizio Gambarini, Archive Foto, dpa Abendzeitung München, dpa 16.05. 2014-15 Hers.
Yes, this corresponds exactly to our common observations, which we made in our private conversations, but which we did not want to name officially. But now that this man is publicly expressing his opinion, I can also officially say that his statements also correspond to our findings.
It would probably have been unwise, however, if we had mentioned our private conversations on this subject in the contact reports, because it would probably have turned out as you said, that we were both being insulted as defeatists, idiots and prophets of doom with regard to scaremongering and conspiracy.
That was to be assumed. Yes. But now that Helmut Schmidt is openly expressing what we both have been saying for some time now as observations and possible consequences, it is time that we also openly state our opinion in this regard.
But it is interesting that not only you and I, but also Helmut Schmidt have come up with the same train of thought. Obviously, he is a man who thinks deeply and recognizes and represents the facts as they are effective.
That is undeniable.
Well, we have also discussed this, so now I would like to hear your opinion on my answers to the reader's questions for a bulletin. You have already read the questions and answers, so when I bring in the interview report, I just have to add them to what I have already said.
Question: what is to be thought of what Hermann Hesse has subsequently said and written? Quote, "If I say of the human beings that they disgust me, that is an honest statement. Whoever hears it, it is up to him to decide whether he wants to blame me or the other person for this offense. But if I say that someone is vain or stingy or drinks, I do wrong. In this way, the human beings could be quickly put to death by judgment. For this kind of judgment, Jean-Paul was a beer drinker, Feuerbach a velvet jacket, and Hölderlin a madman. Is there anything said about them? Anything given by them? One might as well say, Earth is a planet where there are fleas. These kinds of truths are the epitome of all forgery and lies. We are only really true when we say yes and acknowledge it. The detection of faults, no matter how fine and spiritual, is not judgment, but gossip."
Answer: The statement that it is wrong to tell another human being the truth about what and how is wrong behavior, addiction or vices, is fundamentally wrong and corresponds to and testifies to a sneakiness and even cowardice on the part of the human being who makes the observation of the wrong behavior, etc., in the other human being, but does not dare to openly admit to what he observes as evil, negative or bad. If, then, it is established that the human beings are vain, stingy, or drunk, then this can very well be said to them in a decent, objective, perhaps higher if necessary, also in a hard and uplifting way, as a clear statement and as a warning, and can be given to them on their way, because this is only good and right, and therefore it does not correspond to an injustice and is not settled by a quick judgment, as H. Hesse wrote, and as it corresponds to pure egoism, because only a good friend wants to be played, and this appearance wants to be maintained. Are there good and clearly positive self-esteem thoughts and self-esteem feelings of the human beings who notice something wrong with another person and who give him or her psychological, physical, reputation or social status, etc., which is wrong? It is a human obligation to point this out clearly and unambiguously. Only by being made aware of what he's doing wrong, whether it be vanity, stinginess, drunkenness, or any other vice or addiction, is the human being knowingly confronted with the facts given in this regard. For even these factors are usually not recognized because, in the heat of wrong action, doing and behavior, the human beings do not even think about what they are doing wrong. It is therefore necessary that others, from the outside, point this out and draw attention to what is wrong and what must necessarily be changed for the better, for the good, and for the positive. This way of human behavior alone effectively corresponds to the truth, which is not based on forgery and lies. So the truth is that if the human beings do not tell the truth to another about false and harmful things which are effectively found out by the other, then they are behaving completely wrongly, and by their silence alone, they are falsifying reality and committing a silent lie. But this is neither creative natural conformity to the law, nor honesty towards one's fellow man. Truthfully, only humanity and respect as well as charity demand compassion and respect for one's fellow human being, but also the human duty to freely and openly point out to him what is wrong in his behavior, and not to hide what he should change in himself and in his behavior for the better, good and positive. But if this is not done, then no interpersonal relationships can come about or even exist which are sincere, honest, good, positive and of lasting existence, because such relationships are based on open words and opinions which are made known to each other among the human beings, and help them to lead a life which is correct and free from addictions, vices, etc., and from wrong behavior. What more is to be said in relation to the statement of H. Hesse? The detection of mistakes in other human beings has nothing to do with fine and spiritual. It is not judgment, but gossip, because the creative natural laws determine that mistakes have to be made so that we can learn from them and thereby progress, and always better, good and positive, can be learned and gained from them. Thus, because it is considered wrong to show one's fellow human being one's erroneous behavior, it is avoided that he can recognize and correct his erroneous behavior. But this is exactly what is wrong, because every human being has the right to be made aware of mistakes in himself, so that he can put an end to them and change them for the better, and thus also lead a better and more correct life. Furthermore, and this is very important, it is important to say that when the human beings are shown to be faulty, they are not judged as such, because the only thing that is effectively said is that they have acted wrongly, and that they have acted and behaved incorrectly. The human beings as such are in themselves inviolable and blameless, but what can be complained about and attacked in them are their vices, addictions and wrong thoughts, actions, deeds and behaviors, which also cause trouble, fear, misery, distress and harm, both to themselves and to their fellow human beings. And precisely in this respect, much could be avoided if the human beings were open and honest with each other, had honest interpersonal relationships, and showed each other the error of their ways in decency and respect, instead of chickening out and hiding behind completely stupid, sneaky opinions and an alleged injustice of not mentioning facts about actions, vices, addictions, deeds, and wrong ways of negotiating. Such actions, deeds, and behaviour is completely cowardly and irresponsible with regard to fulfilling one's duties towards one's fellow human beings, and shows a miserable lack of understanding and ability to live up to the creative natural laws and commandments, which demand that each human being should help the other in every possible good and positive relationship. Also in the sense that the human being is shown his misconduct, so that he can think about it and correct his mistakes on his own.
Simya, say Silver Star Center, 10th May 2014, 15:30 Ahar's Billy.
Question: what is an egoist? What is an altruist? What does spiritual teaching know about the two poles, about the often mentioned interplay between egoistic behavior and altruism? Billy might like to take up this issue in a bulletin and make statements in the spirit of GL. Basically, I do not want to be premature, because this topic will certainly be dealt with again and again in further bulletins. Nevertheless, a summary or specification by Billy could clarify the situation. I will be pleased about that, because in many Figu articles, especially in connection with overpopulation, selfish behavior is found as a cause, or I personally feel torn between these two poles, and sometimes feel helpless in the face of accusations, my own and those of others. And it seems that the many clever minds who have been thinking about this topic for decades, and whose explanations are available for reading on the net, do not agree either. Perhaps you would like to pass on my request or suggestion to Billy. Thanks for your efforts.
Answer: egoism. Egoism as a purely negative personal state is an addiction that is given as selfish selfishness, although it should be noted that there is also a purely positive selfishness of personal form. However, egoism is usually spoken of Greek Latin ego, me, then the meaning is that of selfishness. Further, also in a negative sense, ego-relatedness, ego addiction, selfishness, and negative self-love. An egoist who is to be understood in a purely negative sense is therefore selfish, even psychopathic, and always sees himself only in the first place. So that from this point of view, he is also a human being who exercises power over other beings, and in certain circumstances, even to the point of violence and coercion. But if he does not achieve what he wants to achieve for his own benefit, then he can be cowardly and insulted and go his own way, but only in order to distinguish himself in terms of his egoism, to satisfy his selfishness and selfishness. When we speak and judge in this sense, we are referring to a human being's absolute self-centeredness, because we are acting solely for the benefit of our own personality without any consideration for our fellow human beings. The possibility that other human beings may be burdened or hurt in their thoughts, feelings, or psychology is completely irrelevant for the purely negative egoist, because only his own I, and effectively everything and anything about himself, is important to him. Not all egoism is the same, because there are different forms of egoism, which are consequently called egoisms plural, and correspond to ways of acting, where only the actor himself determines the maxim of action. As a rule, the relevant actions are determined unreservedly solely by the actor's own advantage. However, if this own advantage is to be classified in a symbiotic attitude to life, which is also for the benefit and advantage of other human beings, then this form of action is ethically fully legitimized. As a rule, however, it is the case that the human beings who are egoists are understood as short-sightedly acting, greedy egotists who can hardly or not at all accept it when other people show themselves to them as greedy as they themselves act. The greedy egoist thus grants himself much more, or even all the freedoms than he grants his fellow human beings. Egoism is therefore usually understood in a pejorative way as a synonym for completely ruthless behavior and judged as indecent. The term then describes the attitude of pursuing exclusively external personal interests without consideration for the interests of other human beings or even at their expense. In this context, egoism is criticized as the opposite of altruism and solidarity. However, this is only true if the inner benefit is not taken into account when assessing egoistic actions. Conversely, there is the view that altruism must be possible only through the attainment of one's own good, analogous to the rule that applies to rescue operations, namely that self-protection is the first measure of first aid. Freely according to the biblical saying, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." If the negative view of egoism is seen as egomania, it is in contrast to healthy egoism. The non-judgmental view is the factual assertion of psychological egoism, which shows that all the human beings would act de facto egoistically. Equally value-free is the economic model of Homo economicus, which corresponds to a model conception of economic theory and embodies the human beings who think and act exclusively according to economic principles. He knows only economic goals and is particularly characterized by qualities such as rational behavior and the pursuit of maximizing benefits. He is oriented towards a complete knowledge of his economic decision-making possibilities, as well as their consequences and the complete information regarding all markets and characteristics of all goods, and thus towards complete market transparency. Homo economicus as an ideal serves to be able to describe elementary economic interrelationships, in theory, in a clear and transparent manner and without practical shortcomings. The human beings who do exactly that which may harm others as a result of their selfish behavior are considered to be egoists. They win by doing so, are always considered to be the most important person and want to have the biggest piece of every pie. It is often big things, but often also only small things, that the egoist can be recognized by when he ruthlessly makes sure that he gets what he wants. The egoist is also egocentric, so there is really no difference in the basic meaning between egoism and egocentricity, rarely also egocentrism or egocentricity. But if you are only ever concerned with your own advantage, sooner or later you will fail. The false, selfish egoism begins in childhood. The child, who always and everywhere receives only the supposed best from parents who have no upbringing needs, without having to make any special effort to do so, easily and quickly develops into the human beings who, regardless of losses, make their own will and above all their wishes. The yardstick for all their farewells, and for all things, situations, and incidents they are confronted with in life. And this happens because he learns about egoism at a young age and becomes selfish and self-centered. And as a result, he also succumbs hopelessly to egocentrism, false self-love, selfishness, self-centeredness, ego addiction, and selfishness. If there is talk of egoism in a negative sense, then this is the absolute self-centeredness in which the thoughts, feelings, actions, and behavior of the individual are only used for the benefit of the person, without any consideration of whether the fellow human beings suffer mental, emotional, or psychological damage, or even professional, interpersonal, or material damage. With all that has been explained so far, however, healthy egoism, which is quite justified in certain situations, is in no way meant. Healthy egoism is a positive quality that has always been part of life. Every human being wants, and rightly so, of course, to secure a good place in life, whether at school, at work, or in leisure time, etc. A human being who has a healthy egoism and is able to assert himself, and who at the same time also knows his limits and has learned to accept them, will also give his fellow human beings the freedom to develop themselves, will not selfishly pester them, will not take advantage of them, will not exploit them in any way, or force them to do anything. To gain self-knowledge and to bring about a healthy, positive self-realization is always a form of healthy egoism, but it cannot be in any way connected with negative egoism. Therefore, if the human beings want to lead a personally successful life, they must not be led astray by the false opinion of their fellow human beings that they are acting selfishly. In fact, if he wants to realize himself, he must have a certain positive egoism. In this sense, the human beings who do not understand the forms of egoism are wrong to regard it as something bad. To gain self-knowledge and strive for self-realization means to be selfish in a positive way. In this respect, it is a fact, according to the Ptaah, that more than 88% of all human beings let themselves be guided by external influences in their actions and deeds, as well as in their behavior. This is because very few human beings lead their lives the way they actually want to. The majority of humanity, however, leads a life that they do not really want. This because they are of the mistaken opinion that they are selfish if they do what they think is fundamentally correct. But this is founded in early education because it was wrongly learned that egoism is only something bad, negative, shameful, and bad and reprehensible, whereby it is not learned that there is also a positive and vital egoism. This is just in contrast to the negative egoism, which is learned from early childhood through a wrong upbringing. So it is because of the wrong understanding of egoism that people often say yes, even if they want to say no. As a result of this, the human beings are always and again stuck back and give in, talk and act against their own opinion, and adapt themselves willlessly to other human beings who have a different opinion, and demand something different than what is actually wanted. But if the human beings seemingly behave as selflessly as they think they do, by pleasing the other human beings around them, then they are also selfish. He then wants to achieve through his selfless behavior that the other human beings continue to speak well of him, which is of course also true for the human beings in general, who he expects to be good and kind to him. So he is afraid that his reputation might suffer, or that his fellow man might turn away from him. Consequently, he does not orientate himself towards his fellow man for the sake of his fellow man, but towards himself for his own sake. And this is of course also selfish. If the human beings were not afraid, they would, so they think erroneously, lose their prestige because they would then be doing exactly what they think is correct, what their own view and opinion is, and what they think is good. Basically, the human beings are selfish in one way or another, whether they are normally positive or negative. To take care of oneself in a good way with regard to one's own self-realization, etc., or to believe in oneself, and to lead one's life as it wants to be led in a normal, positive way, is a form of healthy, positive egoism. A selfish behavior is only harmful or unhealthy if it causes other human beings to be abused and exploited for their own benefit. But if the human beings do and say that they were correct and carry it within them as their own opinion, and if they also make use of their personal right in this respect, namely to lead their life as they want to lead it without harming or exploiting another person, then they are selfish in the normal positive sense. It really is worth considering what the whole of humanity would have been like today if there had not been human beings of good normal positive form who have achieved a great deal and advanced the earthly human cultures, be they great thinkers, discoverers, inventors, philosophers, prophets, artists, scientists, or researchers, etc. The humanity of the earth has only become what it is today because it had relied on all these great human beings who listened to their inner voice, telling them to do all that they were urged to do by their normal positive selfishness. If all those inventors, researchers, artists, philosophers, prophets, and scientists had listened to their critics and scoffers, then today, the earthly humanity would not be in a time of high development of technology, medicine, and general sciences, etc., but would still be crawling around in caves and hitting their skulls with stones. This means that progress is really only possible if there are people who have a healthy, positive egoism and stand by what they consider correct, even if they meet with criticism and incomprehension from those human beings whose intelligence, understanding, and reason is not yet so far advanced that they can understand the healthy, normal, positive, egoistic striving. Of those who bring progress in all things, as well as love, knowledge, wisdom, and humanity among the peoples. Therefore, the question is aloud here, which human beings are most respected and admired? Whether they are those who openly and honestly stand by their views and opinions, and in this way also go their own way through life, even if they meet with unreasonable and offensive criticism, or those human beings who only speak to the mouth of their fellow human beings and let their flag flutter in their wind. A human being who does what he thinks is correct and what also corresponds to his opinion is usually more successful than those human beings who give in to the opinions of others and do everything to satisfy them. This kind of human beings belongs to those who endlessly chase success, never achieve it, and are consequently dissatisfied. However, the human beings who are successful and hold their own opinions are usually much more satisfied than those who are guided by the opinions of others. Every personal and material success in life depends to a great extent on self-determination and self-realization. Because if the human beings want to lead a personally and materially successful life, they must not be led astray by the opinions of their fellow human beings, but they must follow their own inner voice and do what they consider to be correct and important in a positive and logical way. Indeed, the first duty of the human beings is to know themselves, to realize themselves, and to make themselves happy and joyful so that they can be themselves, know who they are truthful, and can honestly say, I am effectively myself, and therefore I am me. This corresponds to a normal, healthy egoism. And if the human beings cannot talk about themselves in this way, then their life is not worth a thing. In the end, every human being can only make himself a true human being through a normal, healthy egoism, because only he alone has influence on himself. Of course, there will always be the human beings who find themselves clever in this respect, and who reject everything that others have worked and learned, say and do in a positive way with regard to self-knowledge and self-realization. And this is done because the antagonists do not like it in their arrogance and know-it-all attitude, and therefore disregard those who consciously and honestly strive for themselves and for their true humanity. But such critics are negative egoistic, so no monument can be erected to their stupidity and false criticism. The accusation that someone is egoistic is therefore egoistic in the highest degree, and in this form the term egoism is usually used in a completely negative way. But there is, as explained, also a healthy egoism, in which both one's own personality and other human beings can very well be thought of. In healthy egoism, therefore, the human beings think both of themselves and of their fellow human beings. For the human beings who do not know the difference between negative and positive egoism, or who are not understanding in this respect, this may at first seem like a contradiction, but in reality it is not. The fact is that only the human beings who also think of themselves and their needs and do not neglect them live in a state of farewell and contentment. And only then, if this is so, can they also think of the well-being and contentment of their fellow human beings. However, if he constantly has thoughts and feelings that he is missing something, then he has thought, feeling, psychological impulses that he is missing something. So he is always searching for the missing parts of his life. If the human beings do not consider their needs and wishes, etc., in any way, then they suffer just as much harm as if they selfishly think only of themselves and the fulfillment of their own needs and wishes. If all thought, feeling, psychological, behavioral forms of the human beings are considered in this way, then basically everything and every behavior is selfish in some form, even in a negative or positive way. Thus it is that when the human beings put aside their own interests and needs and work positively for the welfare and satisfaction, etc., of their fellow human beings, they act just as selfishly as when they only act negatively and only see advantages which they can gain through their selfishness. When egoism is defined, it is usually done in the way that it is said and meant. You are egoistic. But this corresponds to a remark which, on the one hand, points to the corresponding behavior of the human beings, and which is mostly used to show another person that he is just mentally and emotionally selfish and also acts accordingly. On the other hand, the remark "you are selfish" can also be used to manipulate the human beings. The other person should feel guilty by making a remark in this regard, which is intended to turn him away from his own interests and to turn to those who egotistically want to take advantage of it. In fact, there is no reason to feel guilty when someone is accused of selfishness or told that he or she is unreasonable or stubborn. Accusations of this kind only serve the purpose of manipulation through feelings of guilt. It must be absolutely clear, however, that such selfish statements and remarks can never be evaluated personally, because the personality of the human beings is outwardly absolutely taboo and therefore unassailable, and therefore cannot be manipulated. It is therefore completely wrong to assume that a human being can personally perceive, understand, and accept something if he is attacked in any verbal way, because the personality of the human being is an individual and original factor, which can only be influenced by himself in his own way, but never by verbal attacks, etc., of any fellow human beings. Many human beings talk about taking something personal in certain situations, in certain events, speeches, accusations, and insults, etc. However, this is an expression of unreasonableness and not understanding what can effectively be personal. For example, when a human being is insulted, beaten, cheated, or otherwise harmed by another person, whether physically, psychologically, verbally, or in terms of material values, this has nothing to do with the person's own personality, but is solely a behavior or thing which causes him or her suffering, pain or harm, etc. However, the whole of the attack, no matter what kind, does not and never concerns the personality, but also only the body, the behavior and actions, as well as the views, opinions, habits, and material values, etc. The real thing, the personal, cannot be attacked, insulted, or harmed in this process because the personal is the personality itself, which is embedded in its entirety in the consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, the psyche, the subconscious, and memory, as well as in the unconscious forms, and therefore cannot be affected by verbal or violent attacks. Thus, if external attacks occur in a verbal or physically violent way, as well as in a purely material way, there can be no attack on the personality and the forms associated with it. What is personal in and with the human beings and embodies their personality with all its secondary values is therefore inviolable and unassailable in any case. Only a stupid and unrealistic idea can lead to the assumption that one's own personality will be affected as a result of certain things, insults, events or situations, etc. To the outside world and in the face of all external influences, the personality is therefore absolutely unassailable and taboo, and consequently nothing can be taken personally, no matter what it is. Insults, accusations, violence, actions, deeds, and slander are in any case only attacks against the honor, integrity, righteousness, and dignity of the human being, and therefore the personality of the human beings cannot be attacked, and also nothing can be taken personally. If this were not the case, the human being would not be able to be himself, but would be continuously in the personality clutches of other human beings, which means that he would be directly and unrestrictedly identified and connected with the personality of the others, and consequently, he would not be able to live out his own personality. If a human being would take something personally that another person says or does, then, on the one hand, he would identify himself with the respective thing, insult, action, or deed, etc., of the other person as well as with the other person himself. Therefore, if such a silly and simple-minded phrase is used in relation to another person's thing, etc., in the sense that something is taken personally, it is identification with it, which is nothing more than a delusion that very quickly degenerates into a delusion. If the human beings take something personally, as it is said in stupid sayings, such as insulting it, etc., then they think and act in an unreasonable way, because they identify themselves with the insult and also with the person who insulted them, and consequently they orientate their view towards being in agreement with the insult, or to be one with it and the insulting person. In the same way this happens with situations, views, opinions, actions and deeds, etc., which occur in a negative or positive way, and which are taken personally, or with which the human beings identify themselves instead of accepting, looking at and processing everything in a completely neutral way. The stupid and wrong way of talking about taking something personally, because the human beings identifies with something that insults or harms them, results in the generation of evil, negative, and bad thoughts and feelings, which lead to thoughtless answers and actions and even to violence and psychological damage. The only correct thing for the human beings to do is to identify themselves with nothing at all, and therefore also not to take anything personal that is evil, negative, or bad for them, but to take in and process everything and anything, every insult, every event, every situation, every act and action, and every word in an absolutely neutral way. And only if this is done in this way, neither anger nor malicious, quarrelsome, or hateful and revengeful thoughts, feelings, actions, and deeds will arise. This also ensures that no thought emotional or emotional excitement is created, that no excitement arises, and that the nerves remain calm and controlled. Consequently, in a completely self-controlled state, the insults, actions, deeds and behavior, etc., or anythings, events or situations of any kind which occur to other human beings can be met calmly and objectively, or, if necessary, with a slightly or strongly raised voice. Altruism, the term altruism lat. Alter. The other in everyday language means to be unselfish, selfless, sacrificial, self-sacrificing, acting out of pure human love, upscale, noble, noble-minded, generous, magnanimous, and noble, as well as to show consideration for other human beings. Altruism is a way of thinking and acting which aims at a deliberate realization of the good of fellow human beings, as well as comprehensively also the common good of society and its interests. Altruism, which stands as an antonym, or antonym to egoism, is thus understood as selflessness, consideration and unselfishness, etc., but it must be remembered that there is no human beings who put their own interests absolutely in the background and are completely selfless, because the instinct of self-preservation and the fulfillment of all necessary needs also correspond to an egoistic form. However, if a human being denies this, precisely that he himself is in no way selfish, then he is dishonest towards his fellow human beings and himself and lies. Wrongly, those human beings are also called egoists who do not allow themselves to be exploited ruthlessly, and who are anxious to let reason and logic prevail in this respect, and consequently only give as much, and in every respect, as they can bear without harming themselves in any way. So when the human beings demand that they let themselves be exploited or simply be helpful beyond their possible measure, then they are themselves selfish to a great extent. Altruistic action is generally equated with selfless action, but this does not take into account the aspect of the goal of the actions which are carried out through selflessness. Furthermore, it must be said that the view that altruistic action leads to positive selflessness and even self-sacrifice is absolutely wrong, religiously conditioned and confused, because such action is no longer altruistic, but corresponds to an addiction, and has degenerated into personal self-sacrifice from the Latin castigatio, chastisement, in relation to a completely misunderstood voluntary deprivation and suffering for the sake of the well-being of another human beings, or simply for the sake of a higher good. Instead, selflessness merely emphasizes the postponement of one's own concerns to a personally bearable and not harmful degree. Altruism as a concept is a counter-concept to egoism. The Frenchman, Auguste Comte Wikipedia, Seer, philosopher, Isidore Marie. Auguste François Xavier Comte was a French mathematician, philosopher, and critic of religion. Above all, however, he is known as one of the co-founders of sociology, whose name goes back to Comte. Born 19th of January 1798, Montpellier, France. Died 5th of September 1857, Paris, France. Éducation, École Polytechnique. Parents, Rosalie Boyer and Louis-Auguste Xavier Comte. Spouse, Caroline Masson, married 1825 to 1842. Books, Speech on the Spirit of Positivism. Mistakenly or out of incomprehension, altruism is often also called love and contrasted with egoism, which is, of course, nonsensical, because love is the absolute certainty of living and coexisting in everything, so in everything that exists. In fauna and flora, in fellow human beings, in every material and spiritual life form of any kind, and in the existence of the whole universe and beyond. Love, then, is the absolute and unconditional certainty that one lives and coexists in everything that exists in reality and truth, such as in the world of animals and creatures fauna, and in the world of plants and plants flora, as well as in the human beings themselves, in every material solid and spiritual energetic primeval, life form and being of any kind, but also in the existence of the universe, the entire heavens and beyond. According to the interpretation of the spiritual doctrine, true love means that the human beings coexist with absolute certainty in everything and every existing thing until the last vibration of their impulses. And to coexist in something means a total and unalterable inner, intimate, unanimous sympathetic inclination, connectedness, and affection, which corresponds to the value of unadulterated and true love. Therefore, if there is true love in a human being for himself, as well as for his fellow human beings, the fauna and flora, and for everything that exists, then everything vibrates and exists together in uplifting inner and outer pulsating motion of a true certainty of inseparable commonality. Alongside selflessness, altruism is another synonym for altruism, which in social psychology is also known as prosocial behavior. In other words, it means selfless action for others, but never to the point of self-sacrifice. True altruism, this must be absolutely clear, can only come about and be cultivated through the attainment of one's own well-being in a thought-feeling psychological form. But this can only be effectively the case if all the necessary conditions are given, which are directly connected with the corresponding behavior patterns, as well as with the overall physical health. Charity, self-knowledge, self-realization, and with all the material and the possibilities of knowledge, wisdom, understanding, reason, and logic. This means that an altruist must have various valuable prerequisites in a purely personal way in order to be altruistically effective. Compared to the egoist, the altruistic preconditions are therefore exactly contrary, that is to say opposite, with regard to different things. Following that, the state and behavior factors of the egoistic human beings are incompatible with altruism and contradictory to it. The egoistic presuppositions are simply antithetical, antagonistic, and antagonistic to altruism. Seen in relation to human beings, altruism is a speciality and therefore not only a morally beautiful trait, but it is basically a very essential, if not the effective, survival advantage of the human being species. This is a fact that was already recognized by the original prophet Nocedemion and taught the human beings to master their life together and everything that arises in existence peacefully with each other. He taught that a genus, a group, a species, or a people has a higher chance of survival the more often all those who form a group behave in a helpful, caring, and selfless manner as a result of self-knowledge and self-realization that has taken place. He spoke of the fact that in human beings everything is predetermined as an urge by the creative natural laws, and that consequently everything altruistic is in human nature. and that consequently the human being can simply be as the innermost being pretends to be, if only he wants to, because the ability to do so lies with himself. So he should be nice, fair, helpful, and philanthropic without any ulterior motives. In principle, the human beings are social beings. Therefore, they should also act and behave in a dementing way. It is his duty to get along well with his fellow human beings, whereby he should also feel the impulses from within himself that call him to help his fellow human beings. Altruism is an imperative in the human beings through the laws of creation and nature, but as a rule, he disregards this, so that he very often acts according to his own wrong and selfish judgment with regard to the way of life, and indulges in antagonism and selfishness. His whole perception has long been focused on egoism, and especially in the present time of the third millennium, which also means that he has also become attuned to the egoist within himself. As a result, it is more and more evident that egoism is overgrowing altruism, that the human beings are becoming more and more alien and indifferent to each other, and that true, good, and positive interpersonal relationships are therefore more and more rare. Literally, the egoists of today are completely out of their species and are causing enormous damage. In fact, selfishness is already so far advanced that the survival of humanity on Earth is in grave danger, the main reason being the criminal overpopulation and all its malicious effects against life and limb and against nature, the planet, the climate, and the fauna and flora. Unbridled selfishness is therefore the problem of humanity today, because it is in selfishness that all the evils that dominate humanity and the world today are founded. Human egoism alone prevents a worldwide rigorous birth control in order to reduce the mass of humanity and bring it to a normal and compatible level for the earth and nature. The standard of social criticism is to complain about the increasing social coldness and the triumphant selfishness, completely overlooking the fact that everything is getting worse the more the world population is growing, which today, at the end of 2014, has more than 8.5 billion human beings and continues to grow criminally because the responsible governments are unable to introduce the necessary birth control measures. Especially today, the human beings of the earth believe that everyone is their own neighbor, and in addition, due to the fast pace of life and hectic pace of life, no human being has the energy or time to care for other human beings to any great extent or at all. The fact of the matter is that in the family as well as at school, at work, and in the economy as a whole, competition determines everything and all forms of behavior. This makes it all the more joyful for some human beings to cling falsely to claims that an unimaginable number of helpful people are engaged in absolutely honest and selfless voluntary work, and that countless relatives would sacrifice themselves in caring for sick or disabled family members and those in need of help, and with regard to old people. And time and again, it is claimed humanity could be uplifted by the moving examples of such assistance to truly selfless human beings. So what is problematic about altruism, apart from a certain small lack of it? The know-it-alls, the stupid, the indifferent, and the ignorant ask themselves, because they do not recognize the truth that much of the whole of this helpfulness is not in many cases altruistic, but is based solely on making money and a desire for recognition. Money and image cultivation are therefore often the means of the widespread helpfulness, whether in terms of voluntary work or as a carer, etc. All too often, this helpfulness is simply a desire for self-congratulatory, and financial profit, which also includes financial exploitation and legacy hunting. Not to be forgotten are also the motives that lead to the helpfulness out of feelings of guilt, whereby the human beings who have been harmed by something bad or evil are tried to make amends by repentant help. These are undeniable facts which, as a rule, are not accepted by the unworldly and uninitiated, because they seem blatant even though they are true. It is this kind of helpers described above that make the reputation of those who are truly honest volunteers doing a heavy duty to fellow human beings or who are altruistically helpful human beings caring for disabled or sick family members, or old people and supporting them in every possible way. Step into the mud and bring them into disrepute. Just as some human beings are unrestrainedly selfish and cause tremendous harm, others are chronically and unconditionally kind, are honestly and altruistically always ready to listen to others, to help others, or to stand up for others, or to stand in for them. Some, however, play the role of a wailing wall for burnt-out, stressed-out people, for those who are bullied, tired of life, toilful people, and those who are burdened with sorrow and worry. Others, however, do this in an honest, altruistic, humane way for the sake of pure humanity, for which they hardly ever receive thanks for their humane willingness to help. These strangely altruistic human beings also never get the idea that anyone could be interested in their own problems, which they also carry around with them and which cause them great problems. And so it happens, and this is a fact, that after some time, their psychological and physical effects of their ever-ready niceness are felt, and they themselves become the needy. This kind of altruists burns out because they feel empty and selfless in a fatal sense, because they suffer from the niceness sickness that results from the fact that, through a wrong way of thinking, the whole thing of being ready to help is only done to calm their own bad conscience. But this does not correspond to true altruism, but to self-deception. If giving and helping becomes the dominant motive for leading a life, then the human beings disappear into themselves, so to speak, because they gradually identify themselves personally with giving and helping, which means nothing else but that they become a non-person. This happens because an exuberant altruism is cultivated, which is not real, but only inevitably and unconsciously played out with the aim of calming one's own bad conscience, because even financially, socially, and in terms of wealth, etc., one is in a better position than those in need. It is also not uncommon, however, for motives to be based on a great need for recognition and acceptance. It also happens that the human beings who are so altruistically helpful have an unstable self, which they try to strengthen through their altruistic helpfulness, by imagining that they are big, strong, and good, which is why they are needed by other people. But this is only self-deception. Furthermore, behind some of this helpfulness, there is too much of imaginary empathy and false altruism, such as I said, feelings of guilt, which are alleviated by helping. It is also possible that there is a pathological imagination, or even a profound delusion that one's own success is at the expense of others, that one's own happiness and satisfaction is undeserved, and therefore an appropriate penance must be paid in the form of helpfulness. To be altruistic and therefore unselfish is an inner urge, a natural impulse of creation, which is the most valuable thing the human beings can realize in connection with their fellow human beings. But it is also true for altruism that at most a maximum may be done, and this may not be exceeded, because otherwise it will have an extremely damaging effect in the long run. Thus, the human beings must always find their own justifiable and realizable optimum in order not to harm themselves. Quite simply, this means that the real altruist must control himself in his altruistic measure in order not to harm himself or even destroy himself. So it has to be found out how to find the balance between selfless empathy and necessary self-interest. Basically, there are different types of altruism, according to which selfish behavior can be absolutely altruistic. As for example, when in a dangerous situation, the self-protection of the altruistic human beings is considered and implemented as the first measure. In this sense, altruism is an egoistic form. The so-called ethical egoism, which, however, contains a healthy value, therefore the concept of egoism does not have the negative meaning that is unfortunately generally assumed due to lack of understanding. If a human being is altruistic in a purely positive and not degenerate sense, then he always cultivates the interests of his fellow human beings in his thoughts and feelings, and, if necessary, even puts them before his own if it becomes necessary. Altruism is therefore in no way a sacrifice of one or more human beings to ensure the survival of one or more human beings. Altruism can never be forced, because if it were, it would lose its altruistic character. Consequently, it can be seen from this that the altruistic behavior of the human beings is an absolutely voluntary behavior, and, accordingly, a voluntary altruistic action, as well as a completely free decision, just as it is not aimed at any personal gain, utility, or profit. Furthermore, it must be said that altruism is not only a human phenomenon, but that it is also present in animals and all living things, and even in bacteria and plants, which indicates that it is an urge of a creative natural form, which is predetermined in practically all living things. However, this urge can only manifest itself and become effective in the human beings when, as described above, the general well-being, all behaviors, and all other prerequisites are fulfilled. This in turn means that altruism is not necessarily given willingly, morally, idealistically, or normatively, or as a compelling guideline, but as a component of a creative, natural, innate, positive urge of every individual, whereby it is a factor that can also be inherited in all life forms. The moral altruist acts altruistically in a creative, natural, principled way, and in doing so, an internalized morality is expressed, which is revealed in the voice of conscience, and which demands altruistic action. This fact must not be misunderstood, however, and above all, not that the altruist, who is strongly moralistic, is a moral apostle. The human being who acts altruistically with regard to justice for his fellow human beings, when it comes to helping them, when they are treated unjustly or suffer from unjust living conditions, also does not belong in the realm of the moral apostle. Basically, justice is a very high value of the human being and of society, according to which it is altruistically cultivated and advocated by many people, although an internalized social norm must be given. Well, it is a fact that some human beings, even if they are not altruistically motivated by internalized values, also act altruistically, usually because it is expected of them. Which motives play a role in this is secondary, because normally the motivation is to meet the expectations of fellow human beings, or to behave according to a given social norm, or to fit into a legally or socially prescribed form, for example, with regard to a punishable failure to provide assistance. With regard to altruism, there is the so-called supererogatory action, which goes beyond the observance of expectations, laws, duties, or regulations, etc., which is considered extraordinary and is considered to be true altruism. By supererogatory action is meant that it is carried out outside of any moral obligation, or which is neither obligatory nor forbidden. If the act is omitted, it is not considered wrong, and it deserves neither criticism, sanction, nor rebuke, either formally or informally. In principle, supererogatory action is morally good. This is so with regard to virtue and its intended consequences, as well as by virtue of the virtuousness of the intrinsic value which lies precisely outside duty, because it is carried out voluntarily, and moreover, it is carried out honorably for the benefit and well-being of one or more other human beings. Altruism can only be effectively distinguished in terms of good, selfless, and calculating action. On the one hand, sympathetic altruism comes into its own, in which one acts in true unselfishness, and there is an empathy or a willingness and ability to empathize with the attitudes of other human beings. On the other hand, egoism altruism appears, in which the egoist plays with selflessness and unselfishness in order to deceive one or more other human beings and to be able to gain, use, and profit from it. If we look at all the forms of sympathy, we can see that not all of them require empathy, especially not things that are openly recognizable. This contrasts with hidden things and values, such as the high values of compassion and benevolence, which are unthinkable without empathic ability. A very important difference between moral or normative altruism and benevolence is that all benevolence is absolutely voluntary and not based on a shall. Acting according to principles and norms implicitly or implicitly carries with it the message that the human beings should also act in this way. In any case, benevolence is always an invitation for other people to align their thoughts, feelings, actions, deeds, and behavior in the same framework. This, whereas moral altruism has a tendency to reproach others for their selfishness. On the other hand, the benevolent human being does not recognize personal selfishness, but is generous to all human beings in every way possible. An altruist who acts out of effective benevolence is broad-minded in this respect and includes all the human beings. His sphere of action, therefore, goes far beyond the narrow framework of kinship, neighborhood, friendship, and acquaintance, so that he is a philanthropist. Philanthropist is a term that comes from the ancient Greek anthropos and stands for the human beings and philosophically also for friend. A philanthropist is a philanthropist who not only likes other human beings, but also cultivates and shows his philanthropy in his daily life. In ancient times, philanthropic thinking, acting, and behavior was derived from this term and was called philanthropy. Unfortunately, in modern times, the precisely stated old meaning has changed to its detriment, as have many other precise terms which said exactly what is originally and really meant by them. Today, therefore, a philanthropist is understood to be the human beings who use their wealth for social projects, etc., and as a result, the value of philanthropy is defaced and misinterpreted. The fact is that the philanthropist really likes the human beings and puts them in a position of their own, and therefore also sees and treats them from this perspective. He does not take gender, race, or skin color into account because they do not matter to him. Thus, the relationship, attitude, and behavior between the philanthropist and the human beings are not understood in terms of cost-benefit considerations. Effectively, he does not assume, even if he may be rich, that he has to act as a patron, sponsor, or do-gooder for the sake of his reputation, impression, and image with regard to poor people or well-known institutions and organizations, but his motives are solely based on the philanthropist's friendliness towards human beings and the love he feels and shows for them from within. Philanthropy is therefore never designed to gain profit and benefit in a personal way, such as to make a name for oneself as a benefactor, etc., through only alleged and apparent philanthropic do-gooder actions, and to appear in a bright light in public. Well, philanthropy need not, of course, be limited to an individual human being, but it can also be exercised by a group of human beings, an organization, an institution, or a state, provided that the human beings transfer the philanthropic actions, views, and behaviors to them, and are exercised by them in a humane manner. Of course, this must not result in any directly related benefit, as is the case with aid organizations, which usually rake in millions of euros through begging letters and other begging activities, and then pocket up to 40% or more as expenses. Of course, this has neither an altruistic nor a philanthropic sense, but only a false appearance, a bitter taste of commercialism driven by begging and self-enrichment through the begging of well-to-do organizers. From the state's point of view, the opposite of the aid organizations can very well be the case. An altruistic philanthropic system which is aimed at officially cultivating human dignity and philanthropy. For example, in such a way that a roof over one's head and all the necessary necessities of life are provided or finally given to the poor, the needy and the homeless, without any direct or symbolic consideration being demanded in return. This has indeed been common practice in various countries for quite some time. Although in Europe, especially in Italy and the Scandinavian countries, it has been established that poor, sick, and suffering fellow human beings are given all necessary care and attention by the state. In this way, many philanthropic views and actions were adopted, such as those relating to the care of the needy. However, this kind of altruistic philanthropic approach can be adopted by the human beings in their everyday life, for which there are many opportunities and possibilities. Thus, every human being can be a philanthropist, an altruistic philanthropist, and thus a person who not only likes other human beings, but who also shows this philanthropy in his daily life by showing kindness and compassion for his fellow human beings. Of course, a distinction must be made between goodwill and compassion, because they are two completely different forms of action on the part of one and the other. So the whole thing has to be defined, whereby it turns out that if the human being sees through the connection of all beings, he is then incapable of egoism, because he realizes that every suffering he inflicts on another human being or another living being, sooner or later hits back at himself in some way. In principle, there is no difference between the human being and the other human beings as human beings, but only in terms of thoughts, feelings, opinions, views, psyche, actions, deeds, and behavior. Consequently, it is so that if the human being meets another human being benevolently and treats them in a supportive manner, he also does this for himself. If a definition of altruism is based on the assumption that altruism is always associated with sacrifice, then this interpretation is fundamentally wrong, because, as already explained, altruism has nothing to do with self-sacrifice and sacrificial behavior. Self-sacrifice and sacrifice can only be spoken of when, instead of true compassion, compassion is acted upon, because then a compassion comes to light in which the thoughts and feelings of compassionate sacrifice take possession of the human beings and cause them to fall into the abyss of compassionate pain and agony. Thus, when acting out of compassion, one can speak unreservedly of sacrifice because through identification with the suffering, pain and anguish or distress, and the eye of the other human being, or of an animal or creature, everything is personalized, and consequently there is no longer any separation between one's own ego and the ego of the other human being. If, however, goodwill and compassion are abandoned, then a comprehensive altruistic action is quite simply based on humanity, as well as on affection and general gratitude, and a profound understanding of life. But in this way, altruistic action also relates to the whole of nature, and its fauna and flora, and even to the planet. Even today, female and male philosophers and ethicists, etc., still argue about what altruism really is, what its forms and causes, what its effects, etc. are, especially in relation to the human beings. And this is the case even though altruism is easy to explain and can also be understood by the layman. But the so-called learned minds of philosophy, ethics, and psychology, according to their banal understanding, have to complicate everything incredibly so that the normal person no longer understands it, because he does not understand the absurdities of the confused scholarly way of thinking and the language of the same kind. The fact that this often leads to strange blossoms and crazy comparisons which have nothing to do with effective altruism and its value is understandable on the one hand, but on the other hand, it must also be asked where and how far the one or other female and male gender of philosophers, ethicists, and altruism researchers, etc., is involved. Understanding and reason are actually developed. Nevertheless, there are often acceptable and unacceptable, as well as false, incomprehensible, confusing, and even ridiculous attempts to explain altruism, which try to make the altruistic right or bad understandable for the layman, or are actually able to do so. And since the doctrinal explanations given so far explain the basic principles of altruism in the important parts, further explanations or a whole treatise should probably not be necessary.
Simyas, a Silver Star Center, 8th May 2014, 1520 HR's Billy.
Question. Normal. What is to be understood by it? That is to say, what is its meaning in spiritual teaching?
Answer. Normal and its meaning. The term normal comes from the Latin word norm lis, whose origin has been known since the beginning of the 18th century is proven. According to the spiritual teachings and the memory banks of the original prophet Nocedemion, The term normal was already in use at the time of Nicodemian and meant that something is given in effective correctness or in the correct way or in the way that is unchangeably predetermined and corresponds to reality and its truth. Everything that corresponds to reality and its truth is therefore normal and cannot be changed from the ground or in any other way, but only accepted and dealt with in an appropriate and correct way. In this sense, normal is an effectively given form of something creative, natural, real, which corresponds to nothing else but reality and its truth, and which is also to be interpreted and understood in this sense, because only that which effectively corresponds to reality and its truth can be called normal. The value of normal in the memory banks of Nicodemion is also interpreted to mean that the term is to be understood as creative natural truthfulness and as unchangeably given and effectively corresponding to truth, and that consequently the whole is given by creative natural reality and its truth and its absolute correctness cannot be bent or changed. If, then, the truth is considered to be that which can only emerge from reality or effective reality, for there is no other truth than that which emerges from reality, then reality and its truth are absolutely normal and real in their value, and consequently there is no questionable and distinguishable normal in this respect. So, when the term normal is considered from the point of view of spiritual doctrine, it has a completely different meaning from the meanings which are generally accepted among the human beings of the earth and which, in a simple sense, define the normal simply as proper, usual, and correct, and also as something which is so created and kind, etc., which is also colloquially called something which is normally given. In the human sense, the term normal is also used to define the conscious development wrongly called mental development in ancient times, and physical growth of the human beings in such a way that there is no damage to consciousness, psychic or physical damage. In general, the human beings of Earth have various synonyms in sociology and popular understanding which are meant to express the term normal. But this is not the original explanation of the Nicodemian, but rather a special form of explanation for something which is expressed in the following way with synonyms, without deviation: common, customary, ordinary, everyday, commonplace, proven, average, naturalized, entrenched, introduced, practicable, traditional, typical, without interference, usable, familiar, widespread, especially technical, especially military, conventional. In this way, a precise meaning can only be derived from the connection of all or certain other factors. If, in relation to the earth man-made meaning of normal, something is called normal, then it is possible that sometimes a tendency can be noticed which goes into the normative, whereby the normal takes on a behavior regulating character. From the normal in the earth human being sense, a norm also arises, and vice versa, which appears as a general form of command, through which the human beings are asked to perform certain actions or even forced to do so by force. So on the one hand, there is the established and given norm, the law created by the human beings as well as the scale and the standard. On the other hand, there is also the average determined by experience, that is to say, that which is most often the case and what most people do. Often it is also an area within the determined data with some extent. If normality is defined from a sociological point of view, sociology, then the normal is considered to be the self-evident in a society which no longer needs to be explained or decided upon. In this form, this self-evident relates to the social norms and concrete behaviour of the human being, whereby these are conveyed to him or her through education and socialisation and ensure security between the human beings in society. If a social behaviour does not correspond to the idea of normality, then it is a behaviour which deviates from the norm and the norm, which is accepted by society only to a limited extent or not at all because it creates conflicts and crime, which of course is not usually tolerated. In principle, The balance between normality and deviant behaviour must be specially developed, whereby the social conditions of the respective stratum must necessarily be taken into account. In this respect, it is therefore social workers and social educators who have to make their professional contribution in various ways, which is truly not easy to manage, especially in these times of generalized degeneration and the freaking out and exuberance of many children, young people, and also adults. For example, parents have to be provided with the necessary information because the deviant and degenerate behaviour of their offspring requires this. And the whole thing also requires further reaching measures, because everything else is also, according to Earth humans' understanding, a normal phenomenon and an expression of the developmental problems of today's children, young people, and even many adults. It is a fact that the human beings of today are no longer orientated towards the original meaning of normal, according to Nocedemian's guidelines, but wrongly towards a self-created idea of normality, either an ideal or a desired state, but also the general average and in individual cases also adequacy. Accordingly, the human beings of today's Earth have to deal with different norms, as formulated, for example, in the Internet Wikipedia, ideal standard, such as it is also absolutely normal for a disabled human being to have their own home, statistical norm, such as almost all of the human beings leave the parental home and live independently, individual norm, such as the adolescent wants to and can live alone.
Sim Yase Silver Star Center, 12th May 2014, 04444, Evhor Sin. Here's Billy.
When I received from Florina the answers which you had worked out in relation to the relevant questions, I naturally studied them all carefully and came to the conclusion that, as usual, you had answered the questions in detail and precisely, and in a very understandable way, so I can only endorse the whole thing as good. So I do not think I need to make any further statement.
Thanks for your evaluation of the answers, which took me some effort because I also had to use the memory banks of Nocedemion, which is always a tedious, and hours-taking thing. But I actually want to ask you something else, which we have talked about several times but missed something, namely with regard to apples and pears. You said that most of the vitamins are in the skins of these fruits, so I would like to know what percentage of them is to be calculated.
That is different, because not all of these fruits contain the same amount of vitamins, but depending on the fruit it can be assumed that about 70 to 90% are present.
So there is a great loss of vitamins if apples and pears are peeled, and only the pulp is eaten without the skin.
That is undoubtedly the case.
We have often talked about seaquakes in the Aegean Sea, as far back as the 1990s, and you were also making predictions back then, which of course, because they were of a private nature, were not written down like many others. We also talked about it in 2005 and 2007, etc., but officially, and here I have two excerpts from the official contact conversations, 401st from the 15th of October 2005 and 446th from the 17th of March 2007.
401st contact conversation, 15th October 2005.
That in the Aegean Sea, there will be seaquakes and earthquakes in the near future, with a very violent one ultimately being the climax. As you said at the time, there will be buckets down there, huge earthquakes and seaquakes, the forerunners of which are said to be on the 17th of October 2005.
Your explanations correspond to what has been given. And the forthcoming earthquakes in the Aegean and Ionian seas are in fact only the beginning and the precursors of a very severe seaquake, which, however, will not happen for some time yet.
446th contact conversation, 17th March 2007.
In the Aegean Sea, where a very large and severe quake is building up over a long period of time, which will bring much fear, misery, terror, and destruction and cost many human lives, as I explained to you earlier.
Contact report 587.
However, at an earlier time, as I said, in the 1990s. When exactly it happened, I do not remember, but it was probably about 20 years ago. We were already talking privately about what was going to happen in the Aegean in terms of earthquakes or seaquakes. You said, and I remember it very well, that in May 2014 there will be a major seaquake in the Aegean. Now I would like to know, because nothing has happened yet, whether this earthquake will really happen, because it is already the 19th of May. As a rule, your predictions were always correct.
Yes, today is the 19th of May, so the month is not over yet. I also remember our private conversation about the seaquakes in the Aegean Sea. We talked about it privately on the 26th of October 1994, after the 250th official conversation. What I said then will also happen in less than a week, on 24 May.
And do you know how strong the quake will be, and if it will be that big catastrophic quake you were talking about later, according to the excerpts also in 2005 and 2007?
It will be 6.8 to 6.9 on the Richter scale and a series of aftershocks. But it is not the big quake that I told you in 1994 that it would happen in the future and cause a catastrophe.
Well, then this is also discussed and clarified again. Unfortunately, there are always erroneous media reports about earthquakes and seaquakes, because seaquakes are also referred to as earthquakes, which is wrong, as you have said on several occasions.
Seaquakes are not earthquakes, and earthquakes are not seaquakes, so a distinction must be made in this respect. Earthquakes only occur on the mainland, while seaquakes are only quakes that occur deep in the earth under the waters of seas. As a rule, earthquakes with their destructive effects are confined exclusively to the mainland, while seaquakes cause effects in the seas, for example in the form of dangerous tsunamis, but also occur on the mainland and can cause great destruction.
Then this is also clear, hence to something else. 2 days ago, I received a phone call late at night from a man who is constantly suffering from migraines and therefore wanted to know if there is anything he can do to cope better with the attacks. You once privately said something to the effect that the brain would send out some kind of signals when an attack was imminent.
That is right, because when an attack is imminent, then the brain reacts to it already early on and sends out corresponding impulses that signal the impending bad thing in such a form that an urge for sweet stimulants arises.
By this, do you mean that a craving for sweets arises?
Yes, because through them, as you well know, energy is created which the brain needs.
I am aware of that, yes, because I also have at all times to heed that I eat enough sweets. If I neglect to do that, then a hypoglycemia develops in me, which has quite a bad effect on the brain, such as nausea, dizziness, and even fainting.
This comes about because you are a hard so-called brain worker, as the human beings of Earth call it. Your brain needs a lot of energy, and this is covered by the consumption of enough sweets. As far as the urge for sweets is concerned, which is triggered, so to say, as a forewarning of an impending migraine attack, this occurs to bring enough energy into the brain because this energy is actually needed in a particularly large extent during an attack. Particularly large amounts of energy in the brain therefore result in migraine attacks being better coped with.
Interesting. Then another question about vitamin C. Many human beings think that it is useful to take large amounts of vitamin C when they have a cold. But you once told me privately that it was useless, because a large amount of vitamin C is only effective if it is also taken continuously in a healthy state, in combination with zinc, histidine, and magnesium.
Taking large amounts of vitamin C when you have already had an infection or a cold does not bring any real benefit, because it is only of preventive and strengthening value for the immune system. If an infection or cold has already occurred, taking vitamin C will neither reduce nor shorten the illness. The human being's immune system needs a daily amount of vitamin C that is adapted to them. This is 12.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight for normal activity and 14 milligrams for heavy work. This corresponds to an average of 150 milligrams per day, which should generally be exceeded. The total amount in this way is sufficient to keep the body healthy and also largely prevent it from becoming infected. In addition to vitamin C, however, sufficient amounts of minerals and trace elements are also required, such as iron, fluorine, histidine, iodine, cobalt, copper, magnesium, manganese, and zinc, which is also needed for effective utilization of histidine.
Thanks, because now this is also clear. Although we talked about it several times years ago, it is always good to dig deeper and learn something new. Then I would like us not to talk about the consumption of eggs in private, because you once said that the consumption of eggs strengthens the memory, and that the cholesterol in egg yolk has no influence on fat deposits in the blood.
That is correct. Not only does the consumption of eggs have a very good effect on memory, but also on the ability to concentrate. This effect is due to the lecithin contained in the egg, which is also a protective factor for the mucous membrane of the large intestine, and also prevents the deposition of cholesterol in the intestinal wall, and also protects the liver.
And what about egg yolk, which is supposed to contain so much cholesterol?
Egg yolk cholesterol is not important, because it does not affect blood fat levels.
Again, somewhat clarified. Last night I thought again about what Indira Gandhi told me about the human trafficking in India of young girls and women who are sold by their families and relatives in big cities, abducted by shady elements or robbed and forced into prostitution by traffickers and pimps. Religions and sects also have their dirty fingers in the pie, as Indira Gandhi said. Without exception, the abducted, robbed or sold girls and women are beaten and beaten up, but also addicted to drugs and forced into prostitution, whereby, as Indira Gandhi also said, many are beaten to death or otherwise brutally killed. Many fall victim to serious sexually transmitted and other infectious diseases without medical treatment. And as a result, many of the girls and women die miserably. The number of abducted, robbed and sold young girls and women is said to be not only in the thousands but in the millions, while those who are murdered year after year are many thousands, with individual traffickers and pimps killing several hundred women and girls during their lives. Indira Gandhi said at the time that the families, fathers, mothers and siblings, as well as relatives who sell their young girls and women, know very well what happens to the victims, but they do not care at all, because all that matters to them is that they receive a good selling price.
That has not changed since then, but the opposite is true. The whole of these atrocities and the number of abducted, robbed and sold girls and women has increased very strongly, because today, according to our calculations, about 10% of the total population of India is involved in these inhuman machinations.
That is well over 100 million. But when I think about the fact that in India, girls and women are unfortunately not considered to be much in terms of their gender, but that for many men they are just fair game, then I can understand this figure of millions. One only has to think of the rapes of the last 18 months in India, which have become public worldwide and made headlines, because these alone are sufficient proof of what is going on in India in this respect. This was already the case when I was still in India, but at that time the countless rape cases were not published in the press, but were swept under the carpet by the press and also by the courts. Some cases also became known to me personally during my time in India, when I studied in Swami Dharmawara's ashram in Mahrauli, cultivated contact with Ascot and worked for the Indian Animal Welfare Organization, which was under the patronage of the then President Dr. Radhakrishnan and was led by Dr. Sharma.
This is known to me.
Then I have a question regarding the length of sleep, because I know some people who manage to stay in bed for 10 or more hours in sleep as well as on Saturday and Sunday into the afternoon, if they get up at all and get some exercise in addition to eating. Leisure time is also wasted by sleeping or otherwise being idle, including computer addiction in many different forms, such as e-games and so-called internet friendship forums, in which even the last personal secrets are revealed and sex partners are sought and exchanged. Question regarding too much sleep. How does this affect health? Because I think that too much sleep is unhealthy if the body is not suffering from illness and fever, or if the organism is under extraordinary strain and needs a lot of rest, which means that the human beings need a lot of sleep. And what do you have to say about computer addiction and the so-called internet friendship forums?
Too much sleep is actually unhealthy because it can cause various health problems, such as diabetes and heart disease, etc. The brain and consciousness are also impaired and become sluggish and dull, which can also lead to twilight states, strokes, and delusions of a false perception of reality. Concerning computer addiction, it is to be said that many Earth humans are unfortunately addicted to it, and thus live in an illusory world in which they no longer perceive reality effectively and slowly become introverted. A fact that also leads to the fact that the human beings are no longer aware of the truth, and that everything is only seen and understood in the way that their own confused world of imagination makes them believe, which is falsely accepted and vehemently represented as truth, which leads to uncontrolled and pathological lies. Your proverb, "lies have short legs," can have a special meaning in this respect, because the human beings as pathological liars are no longer anchored in reality under the circumstances mentioned above. The lies he tells very often arise from the urge to compensate for his own low or even missing self-esteem and self-esteem, which is, of course, an illusion because it is impossible for him to realize it. For this reason, effectively provable facts concerning him are simply flatly denied, or it is claimed that he has simply forgotten them or does not know anything about them. Contrary to the occasional fibbing or occasionally exaggerating a little, the lying of a pathological liar is such that he denies practically every aspect of life and simply denies the provable facts, but also completely misinterprets existing facts and truths out of his own false interest, thus denying even good and helpful things that are attributed to him as such, and denouncing them as machinations for his exploitation, etc. This begins with the mere fact that he is given even a small gift, because the pathological liar harbors thoughts and feelings that he is only being exploited with the gift, and that any communication regarding his advantage is of strategic importance, so that he has to intervene in this respect in an offensive and contrary way to the truth. To be constantly lied to is extremely disrespectful and frustrating for honest people, but the pathological liar cannot understand this because he is completely entangled and self-pitying in his lies. And as far as the internet friendship forums you mentioned are concerned, it is to be said that this is a bad habit of Earth humans which leads to criminality, bullying, and suicide, as well as many other bad habits of the participants. Often these friendship forums are used by Earth humans who, due to a lack of self-esteem and self-esteem, want to make a name for themselves in such forums and appear to be big. In this way, all shades of characters come together, which very often results in a lot of misery, suffering, and need. And with regard to the fact that sex partnerships are offered or sought via corresponding internet forums, there is nothing positive to be said, only negative. Persons who offer themselves as sex partners in this way, as is the case elsewhere, correspond to no more and no less than female and male prostitutes. And those persons who seek and use such offers also correspond to whores and whoremongers, as I would like to call them in earthly language, because these expressions are really appropriate.
I thought so. We also say that too much sleep gives a stormy head, meaning that consciousness and thinking are somehow dull or stumpy, which means stupid, clumsy, or even dull. And what you say about the human beings who are pathological liars, and also about the internet friendship forums and the machinations concerning the sex offer and the use of such offers by women and men. I can only agree with you. In my opinion, the whole thing is simply inhumane and should be forbidden by law. But as long as there are also elements in governments and authorities that use such forums, it will not be possible to ban these degenerations.
I also agree with you, and the terms you have mentioned concerning sleeping in too long a time may well apply to dullness.
Then we are in agreement and can talk about something else.
That would be good, because I still have some things that I want to discuss with you privately.
So be it. At the moment I have no more questions.
Then I will begin.